Good morning. Is everybody awake out there? All right. So we've already had, we're barely into the program, and we've already had two speakers talk a lot about data. And in particular, what HHS is doing and what Brian talked about is absolutely fantastic. But I'm not going to talk about data. I'm actually going to talk about blind spots. And it's going to be a lot easier once I actually have the little magic box. We all know what blind spots are, right? These are small places in our field of vision where we literally don't have any perception. Most of the time, I mean, we all walk around with them today. They usually don't matter, right? But sometimes when there's something that you absolutely need to see, and it's in your blind spot, and if you miss it, bad things can happen. So I'm going to talk about blind spots, all right? And in particular, and as Julie mentioned, I want to talk about blind spots with respect to data in two ways. First, I'm going to talk about what is the most important data and why it's not what we think it is. And second, I'm going to talk about how we're blind to the real power of data that we actually have today. And what I'm going to try to do is to convince you that if we can see into these blind spots, if we can turn on the lights, as Don Berger would like, that we can actually have an even bigger impact than we think. So let's get started. All right, despite what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, most of us in this room and across the industry have actually relocated our businesses to the corner of change and hope. And at the corner of change and hope is reform, which is driving the most comprehensive set of changes in U.S. healthcare ever. And it's amazing because reform, this is tough medicine. In terms of the changes that we need to make, in 10 years, we will not look anything like we look today. Reform and its challenges are exposing fundamental gaps in capabilities and knowledge, and those gaps are actually threatening long-standing competitive advantages that have been built over years of time. It's also rewriting the core underlying business models of the entire industry, and as a result, creating shifts in the balance of power between key stakeholders that exist today. What's interesting, there was a CEO of the pharmaceutical company that actually quoted in a news article and said, you know, in 10 years, we're going to be paid on outcomes, and we have no idea how to get there. These are absolutely massive changes. Ultimately, and when all is said and done, it's very likely that it will redraw the competitive landscape. And it will also very likely create entire new players. So there are a lot of challenges and a lot of changes. And yet, despite those, it's absolutely vital that we embrace them. Because as Colin has already pointed out, we spend 20 cents out of every dollar of our entire economy on healthcare. And more than 30% of that, it doesn't produce any better outcome. So, and that trend is a trend that by 2025, which is just a little over 10 years from now, that if that trend goes unchecked, it'll capsize our entire economy. So welcome aboard to USS Healthcare. So what's the problem? A few years ago, so what is sinking this ship? A few years ago, people would have trotted out the usual suspects, and they would have talked about aging populations, incidence of disease, new treatments, technologies, drugs, and the like. And yet what I think people are starting to see and talk about actively is that below the waterline, we actually have a bad business model. You know, business models tell us what we value. They define what we value, and we get what they produce. And our business model today and historically has been driven by fee-for-service reimbursement, treatment-centric supply-driven demand, and other people's money dynamic. Now, reform addresses some of those, but I would posit that we actually have a deeper issue, and that if unaddressed, will still put us at the bottom of the ocean 10 to 15 years from now. And that other issue is that we have a learning disability. All right? We have serious gaps in the evidence base that we need in order to know what works for whom. We have slow and expensive evidence creation cycles, and we have very poor and weak feedback loops embedded into the healthcare system that allow us to know what our new innovations are creating. And yet to treat that, as Peter Senge would say, learning disabilities are tragic in children, but fatal in businesses, and I think fatal to our economy. Now, to address that, obviously we need data. So the question is, what's the most important data? There's not a person in this room that doesn't wrestle with different kinds of data. So, and including myself and the colleagues at GNS. And so we're dealing with claims and EMR and clinical data and social media data. Anybody want to venture? I can't see you, but I could hear you. What do people think is the most important data? Anybody want to guess? EMR? Any other? Votes for EMRs? All right. What else? Okay. So there's a lot of different kinds. I hear people talking about a lot. Here's my answer. It's data that we don't have yet. Welcome to our first blind spot. And the reason that I say this, and it's not because the data that we're collecting now isn't important, but because, as Nate Silver said, we ignore the risks that are the hardest to measure. All right? And what I mean by this, we can actually take a lesson from an older era. We have a tremendous amount of innovation that we must pursue. And from a time gone by, when we harness the power of steam. To do that, among the most important innovations were literally new ways to measure energy output. And the lesson from that entire time, because there were many innovations that it took to truly harness steam power, but that without the feedback from precise measurement, the inventions, they never knew whether or not they were actually working. When you think about all of the innovation that we are going to produce in order to survive and thrive in a value-based healthcare world, most of those things don't yet exist. That's part of the reason we have a problem. And to create them, we're going to need to have very precise measurement and feedback. And what's fascinating is that without it, people believe that invention will always be rare and erratic. But with it, with precise feedback and measurement, that it can actually become commonplace. And this is where I think big data can help, all right? It's not that organizing our existing assets isn't important, but that big data needs to go beyond that. What we need to do is to actually make it easy to create what we lack. And in a way, it's abundanza. It is a mindset shift. We have lived in a world of scarcity. Statistics, the entire world of statistical methodology was meant to deal with data that was small and to still draw conclusions from that. There are other things that we will need to shift as we move from a mindset of scarcity to one of abundance. But when you think about what becomes possible when we do that, the first is that it'll literally catalyze our desire and then ability to learn. Imagine a world where measurement has been made easy. And we go, I can't wait to see what that tells me about what works for whom. The second thing it can do is literally unleash the power of observation, which brings us to our second blind spot, which is we don't pay attention to the things we think we already know. And I want to give you an example, which will talk about data that we may have today, but I don't think we're using it right. And it's around behavior change. Most of us are familiar with this. This was an article written, and it was published in 2007 in New England Journal of Medicine, and it talked about the determinants of health. And basically what it said is that we are behaving our way into early graves. And it laid out the different contributors, of which there are 5. But the bottom line was that 70% of those contributors come from 2 things. And the biggest one is behavior, literally our behavior and lifestyle. And the second is genetics, which is understood to be modifiable in certain times by behavior. A little side note, the health care we get is only 10%. So a lot of people, they understand this and they go, look, we need behavior change, right? That's, well, I think accepted. But if we want behavior change, the question becomes, how do we get it? And it turns out, it's not how we think. In a book titled Redirect, The Surprising Science of Psychological Change, Timothy D. Wilson lays out an absolutely fascinating look at this science of change. And as it turns out, to get behavior change, how we interpret things is everything. What's also amazing is that we are remarkably ignorant of what truly influences us, despite our confidence to the contrary. It happens very rapidly, very unconsciously, and it literally dictates how we feel and what we do. It's rooted in our personal narratives, and it's deeply shaped by roles. So what is a role? These are roles. You all play roles today. Roles are very powerful constructs. Whether you are a parent, a teacher, a doctor, a student, or a firefighter. All of these roles, they are deeply personal and at the same time highly social. They are strongly associated with our identities. They exist in a social construct. They all have norms and rules and sanctions, and they are learned. They are either socialized in or they are trained in, and the socialized roles are the more powerful ones. But we all know what it means to be a good parent or a good husband or wife. Whether we are is something different, but we know what it means. And the fact is that taking on roles, this is important stuff. And when we take them on, the most important ones, we actually establish rituals around them. And the reason is that roles are commitments. Roles are promises. They are promises of future behavior. And when I promise you something, I am transformed in my expectations of myself. And the fact is, a lot of difficulties around roles are at the heart of performance or behavior issues. So what do we do with that? What Timothy talks about is that there are essentially three ways that personal narratives help reshape our role identities. And the first is story editing. And you can edit your story to kind of reinterpret events. The second is story prompting, a guided discovery that helps you reinterpret experiences. But for our purposes, the third was the most fascinating to me. It was this idea of do good, be good. The idea that behavior shapes narratives. And what we know from people that do health behavior change research is that experiences of mastery are the single most important mechanism for behavior change. Help me build a mastery, and you can help me change my behavior. So what do we do with all of that? What we do with that is to see into this blind spot. It means seeing that data is beyond simply quantifying something. Quantified self is a vital movement, but it's not about quantifying things. It's about seeing that what you're giving me is the ability to measure myself. That measurement, it's not of the intervention. Embrace measurement as the intervention. Help ignite, in other words, my ability to take on a new role, which is really what this is about. Roles are such powerful constructs that we're actually missing a key role in our lives. If we're behaving our way to early graves, we're going to need to behave our way out, and we need an expanded notion, a new role, one that's not a patient. I know how to be a patient. I need a role in our society for the pursuit of health, and I think that we can exploit big data to rethink measurement, to make it easy, and to exploit its power and harness it as a catalyst to help people build mastery, to help them redirect their actions, and to concretize this new role in their lives and make the pursuit of health more a natural part of who we are. Thank you.